Funding systems are broken, projects exhaust limited resources, treasuries miss out on yield, and native tokens lack utility. You're essentially building this system that drives ecosystem growth, all from yield that has been generated. This is the connective tissue for sustainable funding. The biggest challenge we'll probably have is finding early participants. We know that this model will work. I like to think of Octant V2 as the ecosystem growth engine.
You have probably heard about public good funding in Ethereum, but have you ever wondered how we can make it sustainable, scalable, and community-driven? What if ecosystem could fund impactful projects using their own treasuries while strengthening Ethereum as a whole? Well, that's exactly what we are going to talk with Octant V2. Welcome to Ecosystem Project Demo, where we will explore public goods projects shaping the Ethereum ecosystem. This is episode 17, brought to you by ECH Institute, and I'm your host, Pooja Rantan. Today, we are diving into Octant V2, a next-generation public good funding protocol built on Golem Foundation. Octant has already distributed millions of dollars to support open source and impactful projects, and now V2 is taking this even further, introducing DeFi-driven sustainable funding, impact bonds, and ecosystem-wide collaboration. To break it all, we are joined by James from Octant. Welcome to the show, James.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you back. It feels like family conversation. So for those who may not know, James has been incredibly generous with his time, keeping us updated on Octant journey. We have had discussions around its launch, Epoch 1, Epoch 4, and now we are here to talk about Octant V2 going live. And I would also like to share a quick full disclosure. ECH has been fortunate to receive strong support from the Octant community. In Epoch 6, we raised 19 plus ETH, generously donated by Golem and its validator. So James, thank you so much for providing us that opportunity. And we would love to hear more about what's there in V2, version 2. But maybe could you please start sharing a little bit about yourself, your journey so far, and your connection with the Ethereum ecosystem?
Yeah, totally. Thanks for the warm introduction. And I think it's a big thanks for the donation you all received. I mean, it's the community at the end of the day that is making these decisions. So I'm really happy that we have such a strong community behind all the work that ECH is doing. So big kudos to you and to them for supporting you all. My journey, let's see. So I got into Ethereum, I think back in 2015. I had a crazy roommate back then who looked like he had Sideshow Bob hair from The Simpsons, if anyone knows Sideshow Bob. Came home super flustered one day because he got into a huge shouting match with a Stanford economics professor in the middle of Stanford campus, where the professor was apparently ridiculing him, saying that Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these cryptocurrencies were never going to amount to anything. And so he was really heated and quite energized from it all. So, that was the first time that I had ever heard of Ethereum. And so he started to educate me on that. And yeah, from there, I started to dive deeper. And yeah, it just made so much sense to me what Ethereum was trying to accomplish. And so jumped into the community. Golem had their really big crowdfunding round in late 2016. So that was one of the first projects that I dove fully into within the Ethereum ecosystem. And yeah, I was a community member for a really long time there. And now, for anybody that's been in the ecosystem for that amount of time, you might remember the history of Golem. They had this really large crowdfunding round that raised about 820,000 ETH in 30 minutes, which was around $9 million in ETH back then when ETH was only a few dollars a token. But while they had this really successful crowdfunding round, the technology and ultimately the community started to go in the opposite direction of the price of Ethereum and the total amount that treasury was worth. And so I was a vocal critic. I was, suffice to say, pretty disappointed in what was happening with the community growing smaller and smaller, while, Golem had more and more resources to kind of tackle some of these issues. And so I guess I complained enough because at one point the team actually offered to see if I wanted to help fix some of these problems that I was moaning and complaining about for years and years. And so yeah, I joined the team back in 2021 or 2020, maybe early 2022. So it's been about 3.5, 4 years now. And I've loved it. It's been great ever since. So that's been my personal journey. Right now I'm head of community, leading community building at Octant, considering transitioning over to more of the ecosystem side of things because we have quite a lot of work in front of us for what we're trying to accomplish with V2. But yeah, nevertheless, really happy with where I am right now and where the project is as a whole.
Thank you for sharing this. Every time I hear a story from people who are already in the ecosystem, I love that because every individual has a different story. And it suggests that it's not that people can never be a part of ecosystem. Even if someone is vocal critic, they can be a part of ecosystem if they understand what's going on in here. So thank you again for sharing and inspiring many more people to join the ecosystem. As for today, I understand you have to share a lot about Octant V2. So without further ado, let's just dive in.
So the pitch deck that we have here, just unleashing the power of your own ecosystem. Going into Octant in general. So as I mentioned before, they had this, Octant is developed by Golem Foundation. And again, why that's relevant is that really large crowdfunding round that we had all the way back in 2016. So Golem was in this really unique position that although having a somewhat failed product, they were sitting on quite a massive amount of money. And so when Ethereum transitioned over into proof of stake, that presented Golem Foundation with a really unique opportunity to do something interesting. I should mention that a lot of people don't know this, but there are two separate Golem entities. So Golem Foundation is a split off entity from the initial Golem network. Both organizations are still alive and active, but Octant is built by Golem Foundation, which is that split off entity. We're not working with Golem Factory right now or Golem Network as they're still doing their own thing. But again, Golem Foundation, seeing an opportunity to do something really interesting in the space, decided to stake the majority of what we had from our side of the treasury, which was 100,000 ETH. It's a little over 100,000 ETH now, but yeah, deployed that ETH into staking and now is generating, a pretty substantial amount of money, depending on what the price of ETH is. It's generally around $14 to $15 million a year. And so we launched back in mid to late 2023 and since have run 6 rounds on top of a bunch of community rounds. So within 18 months, deploying a little over $5 million to impactful projects that span a variety of different topics within the public goods funding ecosystem. But the big thing with this is that this model was more or less an experiment. We wanted to see, could this idea of generating yield from principal capital source activate a community and ultimately support a community? And to a large degree, that the answer to that has been yes. Again, touting the history of Golem, the community back in 2021, one which I was a part of, has been, not what it was when they first had that crowdfunding round back in 2016. So what was a pretty idle community at that time, in my opinion, has been pretty reinvigorated with the engagement and the utility that the token now has to participate in this Octant system. So now, proving this model or feeling much more confident about this model, what we're going to be building with Octant V2 is about scale. And so this is essentially the opportunity that we're bringing to other organizations. So kind of running through this really quickly, Ethereum and Web3 need sustainable funding for impactful projects. And so the financial tools in Web3 give us a means to create incentives that drive lasting capital growth. There's been all this work done in DeFi to be able to generate yield. And there's been all this work that's been done in effectively allocating capital to projects. A lot of projects like Gitcoin, Giveth, ClearFund, the list goes on and on. But we've done a pretty good job at experimenting within grants in Web3. So what we're saying is that we need to connect these two pieces together. So this is basically capital accumulation being an active process needs effective mechanisms that we have in Web3. And so that essentially funnels that value into the second phase that I mentioned, capital allocation. So you can think of Octant V2 as this connective tissue or this bridge, which essentially allows entities to accumulate capital, to grow capital, and then to effectively allocate that capital. So this is the problem that we're trying to solve right now. Right now, funding systems are broken, projects exhaust limited resources, treasuries miss out on yield, and native tokens lack utility. So there's a lot of valuable opportunities that right now are going untapped. And so Octant V2 essentially unlocks potential by activating idle treasuries, empowering communities, and aligning funding with sustainable, impactful goals. And so you can think of this as together we're building a thriving unified ecosystem for long-term growth. I like to think of Octant V2 as the ecosystem growth engine, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is my little catchphrase that I'm running with here. So the Octant Vision, community-driven vehicle to efficiently capture and deploy capital, funding impactful ventures across Ethereum and beyond. So this is our value prop. What we're saying to other organizations that have big treasuries or have value flows that they've created is that you can put these value flows to work, replicating the same model that we've done in Octant V1. You can plug in your yield to a system that engages your community. You can set the system up to where your community token is able to be locked into the system, and then governance over the funds that you've generated, either through the yield generation that you've created or some other value flow that you've connected into the system. You're allowing your community to have input over where those funds are directed. And there's a really powerful incentive mechanism in there, because you could think of, say, Arbitrum or Uniswap or any of these big ecosystems that have these grant programs. Holders of those tokens want their token price to go up. So if they're locking their tokens into the system and then they're saying, hey, in this grants program, I think that this project, and this project should receive my money. That's wisdom of the crowds, where there's a strong incentive mechanism for them to make good choices because they want to add value to their ecosystem. They want that token price to go up. So it creates this feedback loop where when you are giving the privilege or you're giving the ability for these community members to engage in what they think is going to be valuable for the ecosystem, you're essentially building this system that drives ecosystem growth, all from yield that has been generated. So you're not even touching your principal capital while being able to grow your ecosystem in a powerful way. So this is the value prop, or the model that we see many ecosystems could be replicating and wielding to their advantage. So as I talked about this a little bit already, but yeah, giving your token purpose, we can be honest right now, tokens are often underutilized, holders are passive, and we think that we can change that. So if you utilize Octant V2, whether that's deploying your treasury into our yield generating vaults or just streaming value flows that you already have set up, token holders can directly support the project's initiatives that they believe in. Mentioned that already. They get a sense of ownership and purpose. And this also creates stability with your token, because folks are locking tokens into the system. That creates price stabilization for the token because they're obviously not selling it at the end of the day. So the next thing I'm going to share with you here is a little crazy, but we'll talk about it. So this is the Octant model. And I think in some ways this doesn't do the best job at explaining what we're ultimately after here, but I'll try to do my best to explain it. So you can see down in the bottom left, it says Dragon 2. Up in the top right-hand corner here, we have Dragon 1. Dragons are essentially these organizations that I'm talking about. These are these ecosystems that have capital to generate yield. The reason we use the term dragon is we see dragons right now in the ecosystem as these big, creatures that are sitting on piles of gold, but they're not doing anything with that gold. And so if they were to mobilize that capital or mobilize these treasuries, then they could actually start to create something that really benefits them. But yeah, just this metaphor of dragons we really, really like. And Golem being the first dragon that we were after. Golem as well was sitting on a big treasury that wasn't doing anything for a while until we started to experiment with Octant. But essentially the way this works is dragons deposit capital into vaults. Those vaults generate yield, and then that yield is split into a few different categories. There's a value flow that goes to the users who are participating in the system. Again, those are users who are locking the ecosystem token into the Octant protocol and then receiving rewards from that. Another value flow goes into the funding pool of the grants program that these entities are looking to run. And then the big thing that we are seeing, and this is at a separate level here, is that we believe, and what we're really after with Octant, is that each ecosystem that is using this tool to drive ecosystem growth takes a small portion of the yield that they generate and contributes to this thing called the sustainability pool. Now, the sustainability pool is at a different level where all of these different ecosystems, many of them being competitors to one another, probably won't agree on a wide range of things that should be funded. But there are some base layer Ethereum public goods that I'm very, very confident in that each of these ecosystem players would all agree drive a lot of value. And so this is what the sustainability pool is about, is each of these ecosystems coming together, contributing a small piece so that we can collectively fund base layer Ethereum public goods. Now, the way that governance is going to shape out with this is still in the works. We have a fairly strong idea of how it's going to look, but we're working with hats right now to define the details within all of this. Basically, we see this as however much money you are contributing into the sustainability pool is going to dictate how much weight you have in determining outcomes of funding decisions from the sustainability pool. But again, just kind of wrapping this all back together, we see many different ecosystems being able to deposit yield into yield-bearing assets or vaults, generate yield and run grant programs, engage your community who have your ecosystem token, engaging with them and allowing them to provide a wisdom of the crowd's sort of value to understanding what should be funded in your ecosystem. And then separately, everybody coming together and from an ecosystem level and collectively funding what matters to everybody within Ethereum. So going from there, how does this sustainability pool work? It's this thing called the basket token. So when you deposit capital into the vaults that we have built for Octant, or when you are essentially just using your own value flow, basically, we're taking a small portion of that yield and then bringing it into the sustainability pool. And the way that that happens is, it doesn't matter what type of asset you're generating yield in, this swapper function that we have just sitting right outside of the basket token in the middle there, that's going to be swapping the yield that you generate into the token, your community token. And so this basket token is essentially an index fund of all of the different tokens that are participating in the system. So obviously, we're doing what we're doing right now with GLM. There's many other ecosystems that might be interested in participating in a system like this, but they don't want to do this through our token. They're obviously incentivized to add value to their token. So this swapper mechanism actually adds an upward price pressure to the community token that they're bringing into the system. And so when we run these grant rounds from the sustainability pool level, the grantees are going to be paid out in the basket token, which is this index fund token that I'm mentioning. So I know this graph can be a little bit confusing, but you can essentially just think of this as an alignment token that is bringing value to each of the participants that are coming in with different assets. Let me move on to this other big piece that is part of Octant, impact bonds. One of the big things that we have recognized and what other ecosystems have talked about for quite a while now is within the grant space, many of the community-based grant rounds that we see, and Octant is no exception to this, is that the rounds are heavily determined or influenced by relationships or just direct messaging. We find that a lot of recipients find advantages in the outcomes of the grant round if they're very active in potential donors' inboxes, or if projects that are participating in the grant round just have a very strong reputation. And while there can be some strong benefits to that, especially if the projects are doing really good work in the space and their reputation precedes them, that's great. But a lot of the time there isn't an incentive to figure out why or where is my money going to be most effectively going towards, or how can this donation that I'm thinking about giving, what's the most effective place for me to donate this money to? Now, we're going to start to experiment with a new model that creates that incentive through what we're calling impact bonds. So in Epoch 7, we're going to be running our first themed round. This is going to be related to climate. And we're going to be working with experts in defining what type of outcomes are we trying to drive with this round. And so defining what that impact looks like prior to the round beginning, and then being very, very open and clear with our donors. Hey, this is what we're trying to drive. And should you donate to projects that achieve these outcomes, then there could be a financial reward on the back end of this donation. So there is a strong incentive to do your due diligence, to do your research, to make high quality decisions in this grant round. And should you do that, then you might have a financial reward sitting on the back of it. I think that's a much easier way of explaining than what we have right now in this graph, but that's more or less what's going on here, is that You have these rounds where you want high quality decisions to take place. Well, how do you do that? You create a financial reward that's done via impact evaluation. So something we're going to be experimenting with, we might be getting some things wrong there, probably have plenty of things to learn, especially with the first experiment of many. But nevertheless, I think the model overall is something that we're really excited about. And if you had to say this in a very, very short way to somebody that's trying to grasp what this means, you can just think of it as an impact prediction market. I, as a donor, predict that this project is going to create X, Y, and Z impact. And therefore, if that actually happens, I might have a financial reward coming back to me. So yeah, that's what I think the Octant V2 model is overall, is essentially giving ecosystems a growth engine that engages their community at another level of abstraction, all of us coming together and collectively funding what we all agree should be funded in Ethereum and beyond, and then experimenting with funding models that actually incentivize high quality decisions. I think that's the easiest way that you can think about Octant V2.
Great presentation. Thank you, James, for sharing that. It was really interesting to learn about new terms that has been added with this V2 version and incentive mechanism. We also learned about the process that would be followed, more or less. It's going on as an experiment, so we look forward to see some changes in upcoming rounds, but it's a good start. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
We do have a couple of more questions to add on top of this to maybe make it better understandable for people who may not have like this deep understanding of the ecosystem right now or how Octant is working. So if you have to say in few words, what would be those to explain the basic difference, especially for the participants' point of view? What is going to change from V1 to V2 for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for Octant V2, because right now we are bound to the back-end logic that we initially launched with, many of these things are off-chain. One of the big things that we're really excited about is when we move to this on-chain protocol, we're going to have much more flexibility in the cadence that we run rounds. So this is why even before we launched into Octant V2, we wanted to run our first themed round, is because there's a lot of things that we need to test with all of that. One of the big things that we've heard from many donors that have been with us for a while is because we have these very broad-based funding rounds where you have projects in the education sector, the climate sector, Ethereum infrastructure, open source software, privacy, the list goes on and on. When participants are trying to figure out what should I donate to, it becomes very, very hard for them to decide where is their donations going to be best spent. When you couple that with creating a financial mechanism or an incentive mechanism around impact evaluation, it's really important to have more of a focus so that it's much easier to evaluate that impact versus trying to compare apples and oranges to one another. So I would say that one of the biggest things you can expect to see from Octant V2 is the rounds that we're running have more of a focus. They have more of a theme. And that we maybe do this at a different cadence than we normally do because we're not bound to that every 90-day logic that we've been running with so far.
That is pretty interesting. I believe this will also help the people who are making their vote and decide, given the theme is there, so they understand which project will make more impact in the ecosystem. Good to know.
Yeah, great question.
My next question is with respect to the new terminologies, those were introduced. You already talked about dragons. I was going through a post which contains more terms like regions, dragons. So if on a high level, if you can explain who are the key participants and what are their roles?
Yeah, totally. So there's this story that we're trying to tell alongside of this technology that we're looking to build. And when you look across the broad Web3 ecosystem, even outside of Ethereum, a lot of the noise that we see across the space is from this sort of quote unquote degenerate sort of persona, these people that are taking a ton of risks and, looking to the financial opportunities that exist in Web3. I know many don't agree with what they're doing. I sort of have a sympathetic look to a degree with it because, I see a lot of people who are financially struggling and are looking at legacy systems that have more or less failed them. And they're just looking to see if Web3 is a tool that can help them break out of that broken system. Not that the things that they are engaging with are not broken, but nevertheless, I see the intention or the rationale behind why they're engaging the way that they do. So you have this degenerate persona, and then beyond that, you have all of these ecosystems that have these huge, huge treasuries. And so we started to realize that there's this Degens and Dragons sort of story that we're all engaging with on a day-to-day basis. So this is the story that we're trying to tell, is that there are different personas that are engaging in different ways that have very interesting stories to tell, and that we can start to spin a narrative within Web3 that I think overall, given enough attention and, being very conscious about, what we're saying, can start to shift the narrative that Web3 has as a whole. So this is what we're running with, Degens and Dragons.
Very interesting. I don't understand how this is possible, but every time we are looking into anything new in the Web3, that has a very interesting story behind the scene.
Totally. Yeah, I agree.
That's pretty interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the sustainability pool. You briefly explained how it works. I'm not trying to question the wisdom of the group working behind that, but there is a possibility of favoritism, like selecting a project, if we have weight proportional to the stake. So I'm wondering if there is a plan to overcome this issue. How do we make sure that Ethereum's wide public good projects are getting long-term funding?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions around that. One of the things that we've talked about a lot is what happens if Tron comes in and deposits a ton of capital into the system, and then they have a ton of voting power, so to speak. So there is going to be opinions around who can join and what assets are able to be deposited into the sustainability pool. So this isn't going to be a permissionless thing where anybody can come in and just start to dominate the situation with capital. Again, some of this stuff right now we're working out with hats, but we know what the intention is, and we're looking to be very, very delegating to where we're confident that the system can't be swept away from a bad actor.
That is pretty comforting to know, because this is always the challenge with decentralized system. We never know what is the intent of the party joining the community, that we are trying to make a public good. I don't know.
Totally. And with the opinionate, the way that this is going to be opinionated, if Tron wants to come in and deposit a ton of capital into the protocol, and use this for whatever they want to do, that minimum 5% that we're asking each organization to bring to the sustainability pool, we kind of look at that as a net positive, that even if this bad actor wants to do whatever they're going to do, that they're going to contribute to the health and longevity of Ethereum. And so I don't think there's any way that you can stop someone from using the tool for their own ecosystem growth, but nevertheless, we can be opinionated around what assets are able to be deposited into the sustainability pool. And at the end of the day, if actors that we don't agree with are utilizing it, nevertheless, they're going to be contributing to something that's positive. So yeah, this is kind of how we're viewing it from a easy to grasp standpoint.
Of course, there are going to be some challenges, but I understand the group is always strong and come up with solutions. So I'm very much hopeful that this will go as smooth as possible.
Thanks.
My next question is with respect to DeFi, which is like a mechanism involved with Octant 2 to kind of incentivize people. So how does Octant leverage these DeFi tools like staking, yield farming, and liquidity to benefit all the individuals or regions participating in this system?
Yeah, there's a couple of different levels to where DeFi plugs into the system. So at the first point that we were talking about for Dragons, there are a wealth of strategies that have been created in Ethereum to generate yield. I think this is one of the big things that Ethereum has done well is that there's a lot of different mechanisms out there to where if you have capital, you can deploy it and generate yield. There's another aspect to Octant V2 that we are envisioning to where we can utilize DeFi to essentially incentivize the individuals, these degens that are very profit motivated, into engaging in the system. And so this is still something that we're designing a bit. It's pretty fleshed out right now, but the DeFi aspect exists at two different levels. Having a wealth of strategies for dragons, but also using those mechanisms at the individual level to where these smaller players, with respect to the dragons, are still incentivized to participate, and where their motivations at the end of the day are supporting something greater than them.
Interesting, very interesting. I'm being fascinated by all these terms and the way this has been designed. I think this is something new and unique to the ecosystem and would perhaps get to be like another public good funding method that maybe inspired other projects to join in. I'm curious to understand Octant's point of view. Like, as you mentioned, that this is to encourage other projects from the community to join in. How do you see that Web3 projects will be adopting this V2? What's the needed scale to participate?
That's a good question. Yeah. So it's really an answer that each ecosystem has to decide for themselves, because at the end of the day, you're using yield to run grants. Now, if you deposit $20 into the protocol, you're going to be waiting a really long time before you're able to generate something that's going to be of substance, or being able to create impact with the yield generated. But we do have partners that are very interested, that have, a few $100,000 to contribute. And this is sufficient for them to be able to run grant rounds, smaller than what we're doing with Octant, but at the end of the day, something that's going to be able to meaningfully contribute to projects that they care about. So it really just becomes a question of, how much capital do you have at your disposal? And then is that coupled with a strategy that is in alignment with your risk tolerance, is that going to be sufficient enough for you to be able to run a grant round? And if it is, then I think Octant is a great tool to use for your ecosystem growth.
That's good to know from a project's point of view. And I'm curious, is there a way to accommodate individual users? For example, those who are not running a project but are engaged in the ecosystem. How do they benefit from staking in Vision Vault, if it is possible at all?
So the regen vaults are the vaults that each ecosystem creates, kind of like what we have right now with Octant. So the regen vault in Octant is the rewards that go to our GLM lockers. So these are going to be the vaults that each ecosystem sets up for themselves. So, whatever their community token is, this is the incentive mechanism for them, for these ecosystems to essentially get participation from their community. So, a bunch of different ecosystems with a bunch of different tokens. They have those community members lock in those native tokens, and then that's the aspect where they receive the rewards, and then they decide what to do with those rewards.
That is great. So just a follow-up right here. As Octant V2 rolls out, what do we see as the next milestone, and how can developers, projects, and individuals may be able to contribute?
Yeah, fantastic question. Yeah. So right now we are in the final audit of our vaults, which has been going really well. And then the shift begins to move towards the Regen Vault. We're targeting that the Regen Vault will be ready for sometime this summer. And that is when, any ecosystem that adopts the protocol will be able to run around like Octant is doing, or like Octant has done. In terms of what you had asked next, we are very, very interested in building a developer community, because there's a lot of different things that we see developers being able to do and engage within Octant. So strategies from the capital accumulation side of things, strategies from the capital allocation side of things. There's a lot of people that are doing great impact evaluation work. There's so many different things out there that can potentially be built on top of this protocol that, many different ecosystems might find very interesting. That we've had discussions now with some great developers in the space, and I think you're going to start to see much more activity from us in the next month or two in terms of getting the word out that we're looking to grow a developer community, and creating some RFPs and hackathons and bounties and stuff like that for development on top.
Many more opportunities for many individuals which are in this ecosystem supporting public good and supporting different projects here. Good to know that. Octant V2 is considered to be another public good funding model. I'm curious to understand what makes it unique. We have heard about quadratic funding. We have heard about retroactive public good funding. What makes Octant the unique in the public good funding ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it's just that what I was mentioning in the very beginning. I think this is the connective tissue for sustainable funding. Sustainability has long been a discussion within the grants ecosystem. Many projects, many builders get this one-off funding and they're wondering what are they going to do next, and they have to start grant hunting from one ecosystem to another. I think if we're able to really drive forward this model of sustainability, then the ecosystem as a whole will flourish. So yeah, I would say that Octant is this connective tissue or this bridge between building up your capital and allocating your capital effectively, all in a sustainable way.
That is very important. Sustainability is required for long-term existence of project and obviously for the development of the ecosystem. I understand whatever Octant V2 is going to do is going to support many projects, obviously public good projects in the ecosystem. And I would like to pick your brain on some of the projects, starting with Ethereum cat herders as an example. What would you say would be an ideal example of projects for considered for these kind of fundings to be participating in this public good funding rounds?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I mean, I think the term public goods has unfortunately gotten watered down a little bit. I think many builders out in the space see their project as a public good. The level of impact that their project is having in the public sphere is probably, there's many projects out there where it's minimal at best. I would argue that a public good is something obviously that meets the definition, so non-rivalrous, non-excludable, but at the same time is having at an ecosystem level having impact. And how you define that exactly, depends on what kind of category that the public good is in. Education is going to be different from open source software, things like that. But yeah, I really lean towards having ecosystem-wide impact as something that in my definition. And the other one would be many of these public goods, I think, avoid the market by making part of their product or their service free. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, just because avoiding market competition to receive funding, it's a zero sum at the end of the day. So that's funding that's being pulled away from true public goods that don't have potential business model to jump into.
I think that is very good piece of advice for projects which are not into service or maybe not directly getting funding from VCs or anybody else. We should consider some kind of sustainability model in itself by the project, not 100% dependent upon the fundings around the ecosystem.
Definitely. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, maybe kind of follow up on this one, trying to understand the linking between the Octant V2 model and this public good projects criteria here. Would there be a way to even more showcase? I'm understanding that when there are so many people deciding on which project to be voted on, it would be nice for the participants to get to showcase their project, like how much impact they are making in the ecosystem. What all tools would Octant be using in future to kind of measure these, that this is good and they would be shared with the people who are voting for the projects? And
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I've always had in the back of my head is leaning into AI a little bit more. We've tried to host calls in the past, and calls can be somewhat effective for builders to showcase what they've been doing, but we're in a global community, and with people sometimes that are sleeping, they're not able to make those calls. And there's this idea of like, how do you get information to the participants in an organized and structured way? And I think if we're able to build tools in the AI space that are able to deliver that information, at the fingertips of the folks that are seeking it, that might be a more effective way for that information transmission to take place. Of course, there's a human element to this, and we don't want to obfuscate everything to AI, but yeah, I think maybe leaning a little more into AI tech can help support some of this stuff that you're talking about making well-informed decisions.
very well answered. Thank you so much for that. One last question from my end is, what is the biggest challenge that you foresee in scaling Octant V2 and how do you plan to address them?
That's a good question. If I'm being really honest, I think the biggest challenge we'll probably have is finding early participants. We know that this model will work, but nobody wants to be the first one to test something out like this, even though I guess you could say that we are the first testers of this. I could see the challenge being, having some really strong launch partners. And this is something that I'm working on a regular basis or focusing my attention on. But I have a very strong feeling that once this snowball starts rolling down the mountain, it's going to start growing pretty quickly because there's just going to be a lot of evidence from, a handful of participants that this works. So I think that's our challenge, is just finding early stage adopters, which is, a challenge for many projects in general, but I'm confident we can succeed.
All the very best to you. Entire team has successfully run version 1. I'm hopeful that version 2 will do better than that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, James, as we are trying to wrap up this call, I would like to open this platform for you to maybe share any message with the ecosystem, anything that you would like to share or share with the community.
Yeah, we have our first test of this bond buyback mechanism that we're experimenting with in Epoch 7. Again, the round is related to climate, so if there's any folks that have GLM locked into our current V1 system, do make sure that you check in with the community and learn how you can participate in all this, because there could be a very nice financial reward for making some good decisions within this round.
James, on behalf of Ethereum community, thank you for sharing your insight for all the work you and the Octant team are doing to advance sustainable public good funding. It's inspiring to see how Octant V2 is creating new pathways for funding impactful projects in a decentralized and community-driven way.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks to the entire ECH community for having me on. Always a pleasure to talk.
Pleasure is all ours. Thank you. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Today we explored how Octant V2 is revolutionizing the public good funding through DeFi-driven mechanism, impact bonds, and ecosystem-wide collaboration. If you are excited about the future of sustainable funding in the Ethereum ecosystem, we encourage you to check out Octant, get involved, and see how your community can participate. If you have questions or thoughts, feel free to drop them in comments. Until next time, keep building, keep supporting public good funding, keep strengthening the Ethereum ecosystem. See you in next episode. Thank you.